that happened, say, over the past 100 or 200 years. Right from the beginning, America was diverse. And if you take a look at this map of colonial America, this was America, about 1750. We were still a colony of Great Britain, uh, but unlike Great Britain, we had a wide diversity of population. And as you can see from this map, uh, if we start up here in New England and continue down the Atlantic coast, because most of the people who lived in colonial America at that time hugged the Atlantic coast because, of course, Great Britain was off across the Atlantic. And it was in these areas that the Great Settlement took place. You had primarily English up in New England, which is why it was called New England. But as you moved further south into what is New York State today, you began to see some significant diversity. You saw certainly English, but also Dutch, German, Scots Irish, Scots, Swedish, Welsh, and especially as you moved south below Pennsylvania, you began to see a significant population of African Americans. In fact, as late as 1910, which is considerably beyond the 1750 date that I mentioned for this map, as late as 1910, 90% of the country's Black population resided in these southern states, from Maryland on down to Georgia. And of course, by 1910, Florida was a state uh, as, as well. Uh, so this, right from the beginning, was a nation of diversity, but it was a diversity that was different depending upon where you lived, whether you lived in New England or whether you lived in the American South. My state of North Carolina will give you a good example of this diversity because in 1669, in order to attract people from other parts of the world, particularly from Europe, the owners of the lands in North Carolina, who were English at the time, uh, promoted an idea that they wrote down in the fundamental constitutions of Carolina. And that was that anybody can come to North Carolina. And they specified what they meant by anybody, particularly in terms of ethnic background. They invited, of course, Europeans. They also invited Muslims and Jewish refugees. It was the first document in the world at the time that was so expansive in inviting people of different religious and ethnic backgrounds. And I wish I could tell you that they did that because they believed in this ecumenical idea that we're all created equal and we're all the same. No, maybe some of them did, but in reality, they just needed people to come and to make their colony prosperous, which meant that the shareholders of North Carolina could make a profit. So right from the beginning, the idea of equality was very much connected to the idea of profitability. It was very different up in New England. In New England, The people who came there were overwhelmingly English, of course, but they came because they were religious dissenters. And the first thing that the Puritans, as they were called, did when they landed in Massachusetts Bay, right here on the coast, was they fell on their knees to thank God, and then they fell on the Indians, what we call the Native Americans. Uh, and uh, they were for religious liberty, but only for themselves. So, for example, when Roger Williams, a resident of Massachusetts Bay Colony, decided that, hey, I don't like the Puritan religion. Uh, I want to create another religion called the Baptists. Well, that was not good for Roger Williams. He had to flee Massachusetts and establish his own colony in Rhode Island, right below Massachusetts. And he opened up his colony to all religious faiths. So it was not surprising that the first Jewish synagogue in America was in Rhode Island. It was not surprising that Roman Catholics, who were barred from full citizenship in Massachusetts, came to Rhode Island. So the idea of religious freedom not only permeated in the South, but also in the New England colony of Rhode Island. And the diversity of population in New York, Pennsylvania, and down through the American South ensured that America would have diversity. Uh, just to give you one brief example, here in Charleston, South Carolina. In Charleston, South Carolina, which is right on the coast of South Carolina, by 1850, it was the most diverse city in the world. Uh, it included all of these ethnic groups that we see listed here, uh, but it also included refugees from areas that had thrown those people out, or who discriminated against those people, or who killed those people. For example, the French Huguenots. These were French Protestants who were persecuted in France because of their Protestant religion. They were welcomed in South Carolina. Or Jewish refugees from Brazil who were expelled by the Portuguese. They found refuge here in South Carolina. So right from the beginning of our country, even before our country separated from the British, the idea of diversity was paramount. And with that diversity came equality. And here are the 13 colonies, as you can see, hugging the Atlantic coast prior to the American Revolution. Now, the American Revolution really began in the 1760s because up until that time, the British sort of said, hey, just give us your grain, give us your cotton, give us your fish, give us your produce, and we'll just leave you alone and let you govern yourselves. Well, that worked for a while, but the British were involved between 1756 and 1763. The British were involved in a war with France. And this war had religious connotations because the British were overwhelmingly Protestant, and the French, of course, were overwhelmingly Roman Catholic. But it also had implications for the economy of each country because they had colonies in the New World. Canada was a colony of France, and the colonies that we showed you earlier were colonies of Great Britain. But wars, as we all know, wars are very expensive. And the British felt, hey, look, we just defeated the French. We removed this danger from the North in Canada. Um, how about helping us out paying for the war? And so they passed taxes. And this did not sit well with Americans. It didn't sit well because, of course, nobody likes to pay taxes. But more than that, they had no say in it. They were not represented in the British Parliament. So the belief was that, hey, if they could impose these taxes on us, they can impose other laws that would restrict our freedom, and we couldn't say anything because we had no representation in the British Parliament. So, for example, when the British put a tax on tea in 1773, the citizens of Boston decided that that was just too much. And what they did, they went into Boston Harbor, took the cargo of tea, and as you can see here, they dumped it into the Atlantic Ocean in Boston Harbor as a protest against taxation without representation. Well, the British were not happy with this. Uh, for one thing, they closed the port of Boston. And of course, when you close a port, you end business, you end the economy, you end trade. And that was economically devastating for not only Boston, but for the economy of Massachusetts. The second thing that the British did, many of the colonists who lived in America uh, had escaped from countries where Roman Catholicism dominated. And Roman Catholics, as we discussed with the uh, with the French Protestants, Roman Catholics tended particularly to attack, assault, and limit the civil rights of Protestants. But in 1774, the British, uh, again retaliating against the 13 British colonies, the British decided to give the province of Quebec, which was overwhelmingly Roman Catholic because, of course, it had belonged to France, decided to give them full religious liberty and full fishing rights, uh, particularly competing with the colonies in New England. And this, of course, had an economic impact, but it also had an impact on religion because the British colonists were fearful that giving full civil rights to Roman Catholics would mean that they would come into the British colonies and try to convert not only the Native Americans, but also the colonists themselves. And they were fearful of that. And they were also fearful of the fact that they believed the Roman Catholic Church was not democratic. It was hierarchical, which of course it was and still is. So they believed that the intrusion of Roman Catholics would have a negative effect not only on their religion, but on their civil rights. So ultimately, the colonists decided that we got to separate ourselves from Great Britain. We just got to do that. So on the 19th of April in 1775, the Battle of Lexington and Concord in the colony of Massachusetts, the American Revolution began. And by July of 1776, a little more than 1 year later, it was apparent that the British were not going to allow the Americans to establish a separate country. So on July 4th, 1776, the Americans declared that they were independent from Great Britain. And Thomas Jefferson sat down and wrote that Declaration of Independence. And I've posted the key words of that document here. We hold these truths to be self-evident. In other words, that this is obvious, that all men are created equal. That phrase did not exist anywhere in the world at that time, that all men are created equal, that they endowed by their creator, God or whoever you believe to be your creator, with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These were the words of Thomas Jefferson, and these were the words that set the independence of the United States of America. And as I said at the beginning of this program, that was an aspiration. It certainly was not true in America at that time. Just to give you an example, in the colony of New Jersey, which is near New York, in the colony of New Jersey, 2% of white men were eligible to vote. Why only 2% of white men? Well, for one thing, women could not vote, as you know. Black people could not vote. They could vote here in North Carolina, but not in New Jersey. And most of all, if you did not own property, you could not vote. So there were severe restrictions on who could vote. All men are created equal, but they're certainly not equal in the colony of New Jersey or any other colony at that time. Of course, the least equal Americans at that time were slaves. Although some colonies like Georgia, for example, started out saying, no, we don't want slaves, we want workers, we'll pay them. It was not feasible in their view, particularly competing against colonies like South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. So the African slave trade accelerated in the 18th century. And the colonies in America, particularly in the South, took part in it. And here we see an example of slaves being led in Africa. And it's important to realize that slavery was an international enterprise. Of course, you had Europeans, particularly the Dutch and the Spanish, Portuguese, and later on the British, involved in the institution of slavery and going to Africa and securing slaves. But Africans themselves participated in the slave market. Excuse me. They participated by rounding up slaves in the intermittent wars that existed in Africa, and also selling those slaves to the Europeans. So it was a good economic enterprise, not only for the Europeans, but also for Africans. And this will give you some example of the extent of the slave trade coming out of Africa. Some went to Europe, of course, but most of the slaves actually went to what was called at the time the New World. That is the Caribbean, South America, and North America. It's important to understand, though, that in terms of what became the United States, only 8%, only 8% of the total number of slaves exported from Africa actually made its way into what became the United States. And even though it was only 8%, the conditions of the trip from Africa, from the west coast of Africa, to the major slave ports in North America, particularly Charleston and Savannah in the South, Charleston, South Carolina, and Savannah, Georgia in the South. The conditions were horrendous. And you can see here, this is a typical slave boat, and the slaves are just packed in there as if they were firewood. And once they got to, say, Charleston, they were sold. And you can see here the slavers preparing this man for sale to make him look as attractive as possible. So since slavery is and its aftermath plays such a big role in civil rights in America, let's take a look briefly at the slave trade. The slave trade existed long before America got involved in the slave trade. As you can see here, the first Europeans actually who were significantly involved in the slave trade were the Portuguese. And then 1500, of course, the Spanish colonies expand in the New World, especially in South America, and the Portuguese actually colonized Angola. In other words, they didn't just go there and get the slaves and get out. They stayed in Angola. And the first colony in America, which was in Jamestown, in first British colony, English colony, was founded in 1607. And at that point, slavery was considered, and in 1619, the first slaves were imported into what became the United States of America. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these, but the key date for the US was 1808, when the United States abolished the Atlantic slave trade. But let me tell you that that was not followed. As late as 1859, which is, of course, well beyond 1808, slave ships were still landing in Charleston Harbor. And at places like Charleston, as we see here, slave auctions became common. I don't know if you can see the writing here so well, but it says Negroes for sale at auction, uh, just as they were a piece of property. Now, the American government, which was governed by the Constitution framed in 1787, sanctioned slavery. That is, made provisions for slavery. You will not find the word slavery in the Constitution, but it exists there in terms of guaranteeing the right to property, because after all, slaves were property. You bought and sold them, just like you would buy and sell a car. And the architect, the main author of the Constitution, was James Madison, whose portrait we see here. James Madison is known as the father of the Constitution. Madison was a slaveholder from the state of Virginia, a southern state. And he wrote the Constitution. And I can tell you, in writing the Constitution, he had to be very careful to make sure that all of the 13 colonies, would agree to it. So he had to compromise. And this is an important point to keep in mind. The Constitution was and is a compromise. It was put together like Lego. A little bit here, a little bit there. Maybe the parts don't fit exactly, but we got to get this passed because we got to have a government. America had to have a government. And following the Revolutionary War, it was very chaotic until the Constitution was framed in 1787. And so Madison did several things. The southern states, like Virginia, my state of North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, wanted to count slaves as people. Well, how could you count property as people? Said the northern colonies. So James Madison came up with a number, and this just off the top of his head. He said, okay, let's say a slave is worth 3/5 of a person, 60% of a person. So we'll add that to the population, because population was important because it determined the number of representatives a state could send to the US Congress. And so the southern states said, okay, we'll agree to that compromise. But now the northern states said, hey, wait a second. That means that property can be people. And that just doesn't make sense. So James Madison said, hey, wait a second. Let's do this. We'll have a House of Representatives, and that House of Representatives will be based on population. And of course, the southern states like that because now you could count slaves as at least 3/5 of a person. Now, for the other states, particularly the smaller states, what we'll do is create a United States Senate. And in the United States Senate, every state will have two representatives, two senators, regardless of population. So the problem here, of course, is you have a very populous state like today, California, and which has 33 million people, and a state like Wyoming, which has 600,000 people, and they each have two US senators. One of the problems that we have today with our government is that this compromise, which had its roots in the institution of slavery. And here you see the delegates to the Constitutional Convention presided over by George Washington, who was, by the way, one of the largest slaveholders in the new nation of America at that time. Now, once the nation was up and running and had a government, you began to have movement westward. And the question became, would these new territories that would become states, would they also be interested in preserving and protecting the institutions of slavery? And it was a matter of great controversy because the idea was that the West should be free. But Southern states said, hey, wait a second. Our farmlands are becoming less productive. And we have this tremendous investment in slaves. So what are we going to do? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to move westward. We're going to move into the new territories of Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, Tennessee, Texas. And we're going to bring our slaves with us because that's our main economy. And we need to do that. So America compromised again with slavery. Said, okay, you need to do this. We'll allow you to do that. So you see here the westward movement of the United States. This was America just after the Constitution. You see pretty much, again, like the 13 colonies on the East Coast. Then by 1830, there was a movement westward. And by 1850, you can see the movement beyond the Mississippi River, which historically is the divide between East and West uh, in, uh, in America. And this entire area now, Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, Missouri, Arkansas, and so on, this entire area was now slave territory. Now, what am I showing you this for? This is a nun, a Roman Catholic nun, and her baby. What's strange about that? Well, what's strange about that is that nuns are not supposed to have children. They're married to God, not to some guy. And certainly they should not engage in sex with someone who isn't, since they're not married and they're married to God. Well, I mentioned earlier the fear of the overwhelmingly Protestant colonies that the expansion of the Roman Catholic Church would negatively affect civil rights. civil rights in America. And when this new nation began, Roman Catholics, of course, as part of the First Amendment to the Constitution, enjoyed equal rights with other religious groups like the Protestants, Jews, and Muslims. But there was still this fear that Roman Catholicism would somehow undermine American democracy because it was a hierarchical religion, uh, and it was a religion that was centered not in America, but a religion centered in Rome. And that was fearful. So it was especially fearful in New England, in Massachusetts, and in 1835, a group of Protestant workers set fire to a convent near Boston, Massachusetts, in New England. Fortunately, um, no one was killed or injured significantly by this fire, but it reflected the beginning of tension, and sometimes tension increasing into violence between Protestants and Roman Catholics in America from the 1830s until the time of the Civil War in 1861. And you see some of this particularly in the 1850s. Why the 1850s? Well, beginning in the mid 1840s, as a result of the Irish potato famine, literally almost 1 million Roman Catholics from Ireland came to America. And many of them settled in the cities of the Northeast because they were very prosperous and they could find jobs and housing there. And the Protestants did not like it. And so, in a major revolt in 1857, Protestant gangs attacked Roman Catholics in New York City. And if you are a fan of movies, this was depicted in Martin Scorsese's movie, Gangs of New York. And one of the leading cartoonists of the time, talking about the 1850s, was Thomas Nast. Thomas Nast was, like many Americans at the time, was an immigrant. He was an immigrant from Switzerland, and he was Protestant. And this is how he depicted the arrival of Roman Catholics in America. You can see here, they're like crocodiles or alligators. They're coming ashore. And this young man, what is he doing? He's protecting the children from the Roman Catholic Church, because the idea was that Roman Catholics particularly prey on children. Now, in the background, you see this looks like St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome, except it isn't, because on the facade, and you probably can't read it very well, it says Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall was the name of the Democratic Party organization in New York. And because the Democrats welcomed Irish immigrants, they welcomed Jewish immigrants, they welcomed Muslim immigrants, the Democratic Party was perceived as the party of immigrants. And that was dangerous to many people. And by the 1850s, as a result of this, a new party emerged in America called the American Party. And this was their newspaper. It was called the American Patriot, because if you were Roman Catholic, you obviously were not a patriot. Your allegiance was owed to Rome. And the American Party, they were opposed, as you can see here, to papal aggression and Roman Catholicism. They were opposed to being taxed for support of foreign paupers, millions of dollars yearly. In other words, they didn't want Catholics coming into America because they felt that these people are dumb, they don't want to work, and they'll just create trouble and raise our taxes. So we have this religious war going on in America, basically testing the civil rights, the religious rights endowed in the Constitution. And William Brownlow, a newspaper editor in 1854, wrote, "We can have no peace in this country until the Catholics are exterminated." That's pretty direct. It's not saying, well, we have to limit the rights of Roman Catholics. We can't let them vote, or we have to limit the number of Catholics coming into the country. No, it doesn't say that. It says they must be exterminated. On the other hand, Horace Greeley, who was the editor of the New York Tribune, said, this whole broad assertion of a predominant national religion, because people argued that the Protestant religion is our national religion. And that religion, not the Christian, but the Protestant, and not the Protestant, but such Protestant sects as the majority pronounce Orthodox or evangelical Protestantism. And what were the evangelical Protestant faiths? Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians. It's fatally at variance with the fundamental principles of our Constitution. So here you have this tension in America, this tension over slavery that we talked about, and we'll see more of, and this tension over religion. And at the same time, a movement occurred in the late 1840s and 1850s, particularly among women, saying, hey, why cannot women vote? Why can't we have equal rights? Why in marriage do we have to give everything over to our husbands? Why can't we own property? And so in 1848, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, whom you see here, among other women leaders, including the Black abolitionist Frederick Douglass, went to Seneca Falls, New York, and wrote their own Declaration of Independence, that women should be equal under the law, under the Constitution, with men. And here is Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was an amazing person any way you look at it. He was a slave in Maryland, lived in Baltimore, and worked there, and eventually, as we say, stole his own freedom. He escaped on a ship to New York Harbor, and eventually established his residence in the upstate city of Rochester, New York. And he became a leader in the abolition movement, the movement to abolish slavery. But not only a leader in the abolition movement to abolish slavery, but also a leader for equal rights for everyone, regardless of your religion, regardless of your gender, regardless of your ethnic background. And one of the greatest documents, and you have this in your syllabus, one of the greatest documents ever produced by anyone in America was Frederick Douglass's 5th of July speech given in Rochester, New York. As I said, that was his home. Rochester, New York, on July 5th, 1852. Well, why July 5th? After all, the birth date of America is July the 4th. So why does he call it a July the 5th speech? Because this is what he says. What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he's the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham. Your boasted liberty and unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity, your sound of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciation of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence, your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Looking at the end, there is not a nation of savages. There is not a nation on earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of the United States at this very hour. And what were those practices? Those practices were slavery and what we did to slaves. Harriet Beecher Stowe, her father, Lyman Beecher, left Boston with his family, including Harriet and her brothers and sisters, for Cincinnati. Now, why would you leave Boston for the frontier town of Cincinnati? It was dirty, disease-ridden, small, not much culture. Why would you do that? Why? Because her dad was a minister, and he believed that Roman Catholics, particularly Jesuits, were coming to Cincinnati to start a colony there of Roman Catholics and to use Cincinnati on the Ohio River in what was then the middle of the country as a base to convert all of the people moving westward. And he was certain that only the establishment of a Protestant seminary in Cincinnati would stop this Roman Catholic advance. So he moved his family to Cincinnati. And during the course of her time there, Harriet Beecher Stowe, she married a minister who was one of the leading experts in the Old Testament. And she went across to Kentucky, which is just across the river from Cincinnati. And for the first time, she saw slaves. She saw the institution of slavery, because of course, slavery did not exist in Massachusetts. And Ohio, in which Cincinnati was located, was a free state. But right across the river was Kentucky, and Kentucky was a slave state. And that touched her. It touched her deeply, so deeply that she wrote a book about it called Uncle Tom's Cabin. And when it was published in 1852, it became an automatic bestseller, the bestseller of all time. The first year it sold 300,000 copies. And this was before Amazon. So it was amazing. And it told the story of a slave, Uncle Tom, who was sold from Kentucky to Louisiana to a very mean master who eventually tortured and killed him. And this young man is the son of his former master. His former master had to sell him because of debts. And even though his former master was depicted as being a nice fellow, treated Tom well, treated his slaves well, what Harriet Beecher Stowe was trying to say was that no matter how kind you are to a slave, he always is a slave, and he is vulnerable to being sold. And when he's sold, there is no telling what might happen to him, especially if he is sold south. And that was happening at that time in America. So this touched the nerve because, as Harriet Beecher Stowe said, we all have mothers who had children, and these children, can you imagine children taken from their mothers, or mothers and fathers killed or worked to death because of the institution of slavery? And so she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. And one of the interesting things about the novel is that she'll stop right in the middle of it at various points. She'll stop the action and she'll turn directly and address the readers. And what she said here in one of those pauses, and you mothers, you who have learned by the cradles of your own children to love and feel for all mankind, I beseech you, pity the mother who has all your affections and not legal right to protect, guide, or educate the child of her bosom. By the sick hour of your child, by those dying eyes, which you can never, never forget, by those last cries that wrung your heart when you could neither help nor save, by the desolation of that empty cradle, that silent nursery, I beseech you, pity those mothers that are constantly made childless by the American slave trade. And she knew what she was talking about because she had lost one of her children to a disease, just as the slave mother lost her children to the slave owner. Now, by this time, a new party, just like the American Party, and another new party was born, and that was the Republican Party. And the Republican Party was founded on the principle of opposing the institution of slavery, not abolishing it, but of preventing its expansion into the new territories and states. And one of the leaders in the US Senate was Charles Sumner of Massachusetts. And when he stood up and made an anti-slavery speech, a slaveholder from South Carolina, who was also a member of the House of Representatives, attacked him with a club. And his injuries were so severe that it took him 3 years to recover before he could retake his seat in the US Senate. And then there was the US Supreme Court. I know we're having lots of problems with our US Supreme Court today, but we had a big problem with the US Supreme Court in the 1850s because they supported the institution of slavery. This gentleman you see here, his name is Dred Scott, and he was a slave in Missouri. He was a slave to a doctor, and the doctor took him to Illinois, to the state of Illinois, which was a free state. And Dred Scott said, "Hey, I'm free. I'm in a free state because they don't have slavery." And so his master sued Dred Scott, saying, "Hey, he's my slave. He's property. I took him to Illinois, and uh, he's still my property." And the Supreme Court stated that slaves are not people. What they said, slaves are not people. They are property. And therefore, Dred Scott, this slave, is still the property of this Missouri doctor, which meant that if you were just property, you had no rights. You had no citizenship. You had nothing. There was no difference between yourself and a buggy and a horse. You were just property. And that shocked many Americans, because many Americans were not necessarily pro-slavery or anti-slavery, but the idea that a human being was now officially a piece of property, wow, that was something else. So the Republican Party decided that they would use these cases, they would use the abuse that they were getting for political purposes. And in 1858, a lawyer from Springfield, Missouri, Springfield, Illinois, decided to run for the U.S. Senate. That lawyer was Abraham Lincoln, and he was running against the Democrat, Stephen Douglas. Lincoln was a member of the new Republican Party. And in 1858, in his famous debates with Stephen A. Douglas, he said two things. I said many things, but two things that were really important. One, a house divided against itself cannot stand. That's really from the Bible, which means that America cannot exist half slave, half free. And secondly, that the institution of slavery and what we do to the people who are enslaved contradicts the basic principles of our founding. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. So he was calling America to account. And not surprisingly, violence erupted. The following year, John Brown, a white man from Massachusetts, attempted to free slaves in Virginia. It failed, and he was executed by the state of Virginia in December of 1859. But all of these incidents tended to lift up the Republican Party. And here you see a march of their supporters in New York, down Broadway in New York City in 1860. And their candidate for president was Abraham Lincoln. And when Lincoln won the election, the presidential election of 1860, the southern states left the Union, and eventually the Civil War began. And here you see a painting from Thomas Nast. Remember, he was the guy who made the drawing of the Catholic priests coming ashore, attacking children. That the North against the South, the Confederacy against the Union, was like the Crusades. They were going to liberate the South, just as the Crusaders would liberate the Middle East. So, what did this mean for civil rights, for Black people? What did this mean for civil rights for people who were not Protestant? Because, and this is an important point, the Republican Party slogan when Abraham Lincoln ran for the U.S. Senate in Illinois, the Republican Party slogan that year was vanquish the twin despotisms, Roman Catholicism and slavery. So what would be the fate of religious diversity in America? What would be the fate of race in America? And would women attain their objective of full equality? These are, of course, all questions of civil rights. And next week, we will continue that journey. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I think that now it's time for question and answers. I saw that we already have a question from Irina. Why was South Carolina the most diverse state from the very beginning?
The question is, why was South Carolina the most dangerous state?
No, a diverse state from the very beginning.
I'm sorry, I didn't what kind of state was it?
Diverse.
Oh, diverse. Oh, okay. Yeah, okay. Thank you.
I have a bad microphone,
It,
sorry.
it was diverse from the beginning because the proprietors, as they were called, the people who owned the land in South Carolina, wanted to make a lot of money. And the only way they could make that lot of money, was by growing certain crops like indigo, which is a dye that's used in making clothing, and by growing cotton, which, of course, everybody who is listening in this program, uh, including myself, I'm wearing cotton, and everybody else is wearing something that is made of cotton. So that was very important. And in order to do that, the people who owned the land in South Carolina opened South Carolina to everyone, regardless of religion, regardless of national origin, regardless of ethnic background. And of course, uh, they opened it to Black folks because they needed people to work the land. And very often, the European migrants to uh, South Carolina did not want to work in the broiling sun and grow, cultivate, and harvest cotton. So slavery became a key element in the economy of South Carolina. It was probably the key element.